Recently, a radio commercial began like this. The 17th century New England Puritans were people who devoted their entire lives to work and prayer. They would not have approved of the sensual beauty of the new Saab 500 coupe. The Puritans believed that to have fun was a sin. There was no place in their lives for the pleasure and luxury of a new Saab convertible. For the Puritans, the only reason for living was to sacrifice and prepare for an eternity of holy peace. Aren't you glad you're not a Puritan? See your nearest Saab dealer. Puritans, sex, the two words may seem shocking together. And then again, they are very regularly put together, referring to the puritanical suppression of or repression of sexuality. Two of the most commonly asked questions about the Puritans are, one, what happened to them? In the sense of, why aren't there any more of them around? And the other one is, what did the Puritans think about sex? Now, I don't know if anybody has ever put together their apparent extinction on the one hand and their reputed prudishness on the other, but, I mean, why are there no more Puritans around? Maybe the two questions have something to do with each other? Perhaps the reason is simply because they lived up to their stereotype? They just couldn't bear to reproduce anymore? Well, somehow the Puritans have garnered a reputation for pleasure hating that has followed them down the ages. Kenneth Hare wrote that to the Puritan through life's sweet garden goes to pluck the thorn and cast away the rose. The 19th century historian Macaulay, in his History of England, said that the Puritan hated bear baiting not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectators. And it was H.L. Mencken who said Puritanism was the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. And Minnesota's own Garrison Keillor has also helped along this understanding by telling us that the Puritans came to America in the hopes of discovering greater restrictions than were permissible under English law. I mean, couldn't you be fined or placed in the stocks if you kissed your wife in public in colonial Massachusetts? Were the Puritans puritanical when it came to sex? Well, we look to the past for wisdom sometimes because times change. In God's providence, we are living in a very challenging day to be Christians. All times are challenging in a fallen world, but sometimes there has been a wider public respect for and reinforcement of Christian understanding of sex and sexuality than there is today. In the last 50 years, the Christian ideal of sexual morality has been eroded by divorce, contraception, abortion, unmarried people living together, rising illegitimate birth rates, the legitimization of homosexual relationships, the shame, shock, disgrace, and danger that was once associated with adultery and fornication have gone. Marriage itself is no longer so closely associated with sexual activity. Honestly, if you think about it, today it's often singleness that's taken to be the period for sexual activity in our culture. That's the time for wild oats sowing. Today, if we're honest, these days marriage is taken to be not the permanent introduction to sex, but rather the temporary limitation of it. In the pornographic pop hit song, The Bad Touch, written by Jimmy Franks, recorded a few years ago by the European group Bloodhound Gang, I heard it playing in the gym one day. The refrain thumps out, "You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel." In our society, people create desires and associate fulfillment with the product that they sell. Well, today, many people sell sex, and they sell everything else by it. But don't miss the real message. You and me, baby, ain't nothing but money for people and companies that want to sell us their honey. That's what's going on with the use of sex in this culture. Now, in a time marked by this rapid dissolution of a Christian understanding of sex, what do the Puritans have to teach us about sex? Well, first you have to understand what the backdrop of the Protestant Reformation was. The backdrop was that of a Roman Catholic church which valued virginity above marriage. Prudery was more the domain of the Roman Catholics, who thought that you could not have sex even with your wife without sinning. They thought that the sin of concupiscence, of lust, was a necessary part of every act of conjugal love with your wife. So Aquinas wrote that, quote, "It would seem that impotence is not an impediment to marriage, for carnal copulation is not essential to marriage, since marriage is more perfect when both parties observe continency." That's why Roman Catholic theologians have suggested abstinence, and I'm quoting here, on Thursday in memory of Christ's arrest, on Friday in memory of his death, on Saturday in honor of the Virgin Mary, on Sunday in honor of the resurrection, and on Monday in commemoration of the departed. Their message was clear. Sex was shameful. Virginity was best. Now, Luther comes along, and in God's grace, Luther reverses the order. He said that clerical celibacy, the celibacy of the priests, had been a disaster. He says cardinals who limited themselves to women were considered saints. So unnatural have the effects been. Neither the parents nor the Pope, he said, could forbid marriage legitimately any more than they could rightly forbid eating or drinking. He stressed 1 Corinthians 7:2 and marriage's role as a protection against immorality more than its purpose in procreation, as the Roman Catholic writers had stressed. Luther was very positive about marriage overall, though it should be said, if you read Luther, he said more than just positive things. He said some very realistic things. He once said that, quote, "The reproduction of mankind is a great marvel and mystery. Had God consulted me in the matter, I should have advised him to continue the generation of the species by fashioning them out of clay." He was also realistic about the challenges of marriage. Luther wrote, "Good God, what a lot of vexation there is in marriage. Adam has made a muck of our nature. Think of all the rows Adam and Eve must have had in the course of their 900 years. Eve would say, 'You ate the apple.' And Adam would reply, 'You gave it to me.'" Well, the 16th and the 17th centuries knew a lot of immorality. I don't want to make you think that today we're immoral and immorality didn't exist in the past. You can see that in everything from Shakespeare's plays to surviving songs and cheap, lewd books that were sold for a couple of pennies. Alan Carden writes, "The Puritans put strict biblical parameters around sex because they valued it, not because they were embarrassed by it or opposed to it." No, marriage was very much a part of the Puritans' lives. The Puritans were plain people, even in their marriages, even in their practices. So in 1656, the Justice of the Peace at Woolwich asked Sir James Halket if he intended to marry Anne Murray. He answered yes. He asked Anne Murray if she intended to marry Sir James Halket. She said yes. Then he said, "I pronounce you man and wife." That was the marriage ceremony. The plain gold ring that many people wear today was actually a modification inspired by the Puritans, some of whom went to the extent in colonial New England of wearing none at all. But those who did, formerly, the rings were much more elaborate. But it was the Puritans who wanted plainness and simplicity. Plainness, they thought, could adorn even the joys of marriage. Now, while the idea of marrying for romantic love was already around in the 17th century, the Puritans were not exactly like us in our assumptions about this. We think first, if people fall in love, they should marry. If they don't fall in love, they shouldn't marry. And today it's commonly thought if they fall out of love, once married, well, then they should divorce. Well, normally the Puritans would decide to marry before they knew who they were going to marry. They would decide that it was time to marry, even though they had no particular person in mind. Edmund Morgan, the historian at Yale, put it this way: Puritan love was not so much the cause as it was the product of marriage. It was the chief duty of husband and wife toward each other, but it did not necessarily form a sufficient reason for marriage. The advice was not that couples should not marry unless they love each other, but that they should not marry unless they can love each other. London Puritan preacher Richard Steele expressed it pithily. He said, "Do not first love and then consider, but first consider and then love." Now, you shouldn't get the idea from this that there's no affection in these Puritan marriages. There's a lot of affectionate language of heart, of beauty, of love, of sense in many of the Puritans, from Richard Sibbes to Jonathan Edwards. That language is common. And they wrote at length about marriage. They did it without ever explicitly mentioning its sexual side. Or if mentioning it, doing it very briefly, maintaining that the marriage bed is honorable from Hebrews 13, or perhaps giving a glancing blow to Rome's wrong exaltation of virginity and denigration of marriage. The natural place to look, obviously, would be where? The Song of Solomon. But every Puritan commentary on the Song of Solomon is all about Christ's love for the church. I mean, they just blow right past any of the stuff that CJ or Ben have talked to us about today. They went right to Christ and the church, and that's what they talk about. The Song of Solomon was one of their favorite books. They preach from it often, but only as allegory. But when you can find them actually commenting on marriage itself, their comments are warm, even sweet. Thomas Gattaker wrote that, quote, "There is no society more near, more entire, more needful, more kindly, more delightful, more comfortable, more constant, more continual than the society of a man and wife, the main root, source, and original of all other societies." Over against the traditional Roman Catholic writings that would depict women as snares, John Cotton wrote that, quote, "Women are creatures without which there is no comfortable living for man. They are a sort of blasphemers, then, who despise and decry them and call them a necessary evil, for they are a necessary good." Oliver Cromwell, no theologian, the military protector and ruler of England, wrote to his daughter Bridget, "Dear heart, let not thy love for thy spouse in any way cool thy desire for Christ. That which is most lovable in thy spouse is the image of Christ in him. Look to this and love it most, and everything else for this." Now, friends, that's a typical Puritan attitude towards sex and marriage. Cotton Mather called his second wife, quote, "a most lovely creature, and such a gift of heaven to me and mine that the sense thereof dissolves me into tears of joy." And Jonathan Edwards' famous last words were of his wife Sarah, in which he said, "Give my kindest love to my dear wife, and tell her that the uncommon union which has so long subsisted between us has been of such a nature as I trust is spiritual, and therefore will continue forever." And these thoughts of marriage weren't just those among the literate preachers who were publishing books and sermons. No, we see we have little things that show that this had permeated the churches. There's one interesting monument in a church at Colworth in Bedfordshire in England that was erected in 1641 to Sir William Dyer by his wife Catherine. He died first, and carved on this monument is his widow Catherine's verse to him. She writes, "My dearest dust, could not thy hasty day afford thy drowsy patience leave to stay 1 hour longer, so that we might either sit up or gone to bed together? But since thy finished labor hath possessed thy weary limbs with early rest, enjoy it sweetly, and thy widow bride shall soon repose her by thy slumbering side, whose business now is only to prepare my nightly dress and call to prayer. Mine eyes wax heavy, and the day grows cold. Draw the closed curtains, and make room. My dearest dust, I come. It may seem strange to you putting together that reality about death, and yet the reality of love. But the Puritans lived in that kind of world, and they understood the world they lived in. And they lived in it with gusto and with affection. Now, frankly, most of what the Puritans wrote explicitly about sex was about sexual sin. It vexed and mystified the Puritan ministers in Old and New England why sexual sin should be so prevalent. John Flavel marveled, quote, "It is a matter of just admiration how the sin of uncleanness should grow so epidemical and common as it doth. And yet for all this, to the amazement of all serious observers, never was there any age more infamous for this sin than the present ages, and that under the clear, shining light of the gospel." In New England, too, Jonathan Edwards thought that in his day things were going downhill morally. Quote, "The land is vastly corrupted as to this sin within this few years. Young people take more and more of a licentious liberty in their keeping company, and there's not that discountenance of such things as there formerly used to be. It is not now such a discredit, 'Tis not accounted such a blot and disgrace to a person. I believe there's not a country in the Christian world, however debauched and vicious, where parents indulge their children in such liberties in company keeping as they do in this country. On the other hand, one of the most famous facts about the Puritans is that they actually worked hard to encourage and even enforce sexual relations between spouses. So if a husband deserted his wife but remained in the jurisdiction of a Puritan government, he was promptly sent back to her. That was just not allowed. Over 60 years ago now, Edmund Morgan unearthed a case in the First Church of Boston, which has subsequently become sort of minorly famous, where James Mattock was excommunicated because, and I quote here from the church records, he denied conjugal fellowship unto his wife for the space of 2 years together, upon pretense of taking revenge upon himself for his abusing of her before marriage. Now, friends, that's the kind of church discipline we need. Either for having it with the wrong person or too little of it with the right person, sex was a matter in which sin seemed to come all too easily to people. The Puritans were not naive. They knew that all pleasure was not good. They had read Jesus' interpretation of the parable of the sower and the seed, where in Mark 4:19 he mentions the desires for other things, or as it's put in Luke chapter 8, life's pleasures, hedonon, as something which could choke true life. As Richard Sibbes said, take heed of worldly mindedness, which will glue thy affections to the earth, and will not suffer them to be lifted up to Christ. Take heed of the pleasures of the world, lest they drown thy soul as they do the souls of many that profess themselves to be Christians. They saw Bunyan's Vanity Fair not only on the pages of Pilgrim's Progress, but in their world around them, and even in their own hearts. They were not Stoics, but they were suspicious of pleasure. Benjamin Needler cautioned his hearers, citing the Garden of Eden and Eve in it, learn to suspect things that are delightful. I found especially helpful for meditating on a Christian view of pleasure 2 Puritan ministers who were preaching or writing in the second half of the 17th century in England, John Flavel and Richard Baxter. John Flavel said that, quote, most of those souls that are now in hell are there upon the account of their indulgence to the flesh. They could not deny the flesh and now are denied by God. He preached clearly and powerfully that sex outside of marriage couldn't please God because it was being used contrary to God's purpose and command. And yet, as part of our depravity, Flavel said, we now feel that there is, quote, no fruit so sweet to corrupt nature as forbidden fruit. And it's this self-knowledge that needs to make us so careful. Richard Baxter warned, when you are looking on the cup or gazing on an alluring beauty or wantonly dallying and pleasing your senses with things unsafe, you little know how far beyond your intentions you may be drawn, and how deep the wound may prove, how great the smart, or how long and difficult the cure. Baxter, one of the most insightful reflectors and writers on what he calls flesh-pleasing, goes on. Flesh-pleasing is the grand idolatry of the world, and the flesh, the greatest idol that was ever set up against God. That is a man's God which he taketh for his chief good, and loveth best, and trusteth in most, and is most desirous to please. And this is the flesh to every sensualist. It, flesh-pleasing, is the sin of sins, the end of all sin, and therefore the very sum and life of all. All the evil wicked men commit is ultimately to please the flesh. The love of flesh-pleasing is the cause of all. Pride and covetousness and whoredom and wantonness and gluttony and drunkenness and all the rest are but either the immediate works of sensuality and flesh-pleasing or the distant service of it by laying in provision for it. Cure this sin, and you've taken off the poise and cured all the positive sins of the soul. Though the privative sins would be still uncured if there were no more done, because that which makes the clock stand still is not enough to make it go right. But indeed, nothing but the love of pleasing God can truly cure the love of pleasing flesh. And such a cure is the cure of every sin. More graphically, he warns, when the skull is cast up with the spade to make room for a successor, you may see the hole where all the meat and drink went in, and the hideous seat of the face, which sometimes was the discovery of wantonness, pride, and scorn, but you'll see no signs of mirth or pleasure. Go to the grave and see there the end of fleshly pleasure and what is all that it will do for you at the last. Baxter continues with careful advice. Seek not the ease and pleasure of a little walking, breathing clay, when you should be seeking and foretasting the everlasting pleasure. Here lieth your danger and your work. Strive more against your own flesh than against all your enemies in earth and hell. If you be saved from this, you are saved from them all. Christ suffered in the flesh to tell you that it is not pampering, but suffering that your flesh must expect if you will reign with him. Now, Baxter was typical of the Puritans in feeling that sexual sins were particularly devastating ones. Matthew Henry wrote that no sin doth more deface the image of God's holiness upon the soul than uncleanness doth, nor render it more odious in the eyes of the pure and holy God. Now, these warnings may sound too ascetic or too stoic, but after reading and meditating on hundreds of pages like this, I don't think so. I think that, and we can talk about it maybe more tonight, but I think that they're simply meditating upon the very serious thing that Paul warns us about in 1 Corinthians 6:18. Where Paul says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. All right, well then what's the positive Puritan message about sexual pleasure? Well, to summarize it in a phrase, it would be that all pleasures are to be subordinate to pleasure in God. All pleasures are to be subordinate to pleasure in God. Baxter again. Every pleasing of the flesh which is capable of being referred to a higher end and is not so referred and used is a sin. That which is not desired as a means to some higher end is desired as our ultimate end in itself. But only God, he writes, is man's lawful ultimate end. Baxter says that pleasure is so much the end of man, which his nature leadeth him to desire, that the chief thing in the world to make a man good and happy is to engage his heart to those pleasures which are good and make men happy. And if the chief thing to make him bad and miserable is to engage him in the pleasures which make men bad and end in misery. Now, of course, sexual pleasure is naturally suspect because it is immediately pleasing apart from God. You don't need to be a Christian to enjoy the short-term benefits of sex. And so Baxter warns, suspect all that love, which selfishness and fleshly interest have a hand in. Is it some bodily pleasure that you love so much? We are so much apter to exceed and sin in carnal fleshly mindedness than in loving what is good for our souls, that there we should be much more suspicious. And Baxter brings these truths down to a very practical level. Quote, in sum, all pleasing of the flesh which is lawful must have these qualifications. 1, God's glory must be the ultimate end. 2, the matter must be lawful and not forbidden. 3, therefore it must not be to the hindrance of duty. 4, nor to the drawing of us to sin. 5, nor to the hurt of our health. 6, nor too highly valued or too dearly bought. And 7, the measure must be moderate. Where any of these are wanting, it is sin. And where flesh-pleasing is habitually in the bent of heart and life preferred before the pleasing of God, it proves the soul in captivity to the flesh and in a damnable condition. The modern writer John Adair sums it up well. The Puritans could enjoy a good bed because he knew the end of all sleep was rest, and that was refreshment for activity. To love sleep and ease for their own sake was to mistake their end. Meat and drink existed not for the purpose of pleasure, but so that we might serve God better. If a man's mind delights in eating and drinking for their own sake, he has succumbed to the lust of the flesh. In enjoying good things, the Puritan kept in mind why they had been ordained. So, on the one hand, the Puritans were not ascetics. On the other hand, they weren't sensualists. Sensual pleasures were not first for them. They would always need to be subjected to the glory of God.